The NTSB preliminary report is out on the mid-air collision between the Civil Air Patrol Cessna 206 and Globe Swift aircraft at Minden, Nevada back on 16 September. This is a great reminder of the importance of proper radio procedures and pattern procedures at non-towered airports. Let's check it out. I first covered this event on 19 September, just a couple days after the mid-air collision, and I had an actual interview with the pilot of the Cessna 206 aircraft, and everything that the pilot in the 206 aircraft said is corroborated here in the NTSB preliminary report. My name is Juan Brown. You're watching the Blanco Lirio channel. Let's check it out. On September 16, 2024, 0946 Pacific Daylight Time, a Globe Swift, November 78074, and a Textron Aviation Cessna 206 stationary, November 844 Charlie Pop, were substantially damaged when they were involved in an accident near the Minden Tahoe Airport, Minden, Nevada. The Swift pilot was fatally injured, and the Cessna pilot and instructor pilot were not injured. The Swift was operated under FAR Part 91 personal flight, as was the Cessna. The pilot of the Swift who was killed was Don Bartholomew, well known in the Swift community as a restorer of Swift aircraft and a holder of numerous STCs available for the Globe Swift aircraft. The Globe Swift is a very neat low-wing aircraft designed in the 1940s, low-wing retractable gear, two-seat, side-by-side with a yoke aircraft. The Minden Airport is located just east of Lake Tahoe in the state of Nevada, and Don's private airstrip is this Pine Nut airstrip located just to the south and east of Minden Airport. At the day of the accident, Don was ferrying one of his Swift aircraft from his dirt airstrip here at Pine Nut up to Minden to store in his hangar in preparation for the annual Swift fly-in here in California. The runway that they were using at the time of the accident was runway 34, landing to the north at Minden, left-hand traffic. In the Cessna 206 were two pilots performing a check ride, a Civil Air Patrol formal check ride in the 206 at the time of the accident. The left-seated pilot of the Cessna stated that the purpose of the flight was to perform a Form 5 flight, which is a check ride, an annual check ride where he demonstrates fundamental flight maneuvers. After maneuvering south of the airport, he performed the RNAV 3-4 instrument approach, overflew the airport on the missed approach, and at no time was he using any form of vision restriction devices. He was not under the hood. The pilot then entered the traffic pattern for a short field landing on runway 34, making radio announcements about his intentions. We'll take a look at those GPS tracks and radio announcements in a minute. After the short field landing, the Cessna pilot executed a touch and go. He transitioned to the crosswind at 5,300 feet MSL and continued climbing to the downwind leg where he planned to ascend to the traffic pattern altitude of 5,700 feet MSL. From looking at his flight track, the pilot estimated that at 9:46:37 he heard a radio call from another airplane that stated that they were on a 45-degree intercept for the downwind leg of runway 34. At that time, both he and the right-seated instructor pilot began scanning for traffic outside, but could not locate the other airplane. The pilot asked the instructor pilot, the pilot in the right seat of the Cessna 206, to check his iPad for NTSB traffic, and he was not able to locate any airplanes. The pilot stated he was making his radio call of his position while on the downwind leg. It looks to me like he was on the crosswind leg. When around 5,400 feet MSL, the airplane impacted the Swift. He never observed the airplane and instead believed that the engine or propeller blade experienced a catastrophic failure. The windscreen of the 206 became covered in oil, and the nose cowling flew upward and was pinned against the windscreen, only allowing visibility through the open oil door. And we discussed that in the first interview with those pilots. The instructor pilot assumed the flight controls and made an emergency landing to runway 12, which was just off to their left at the time. The pilot emphasized that the pattern they flew was normal, and both he and the instructor pilot were actively scanning outside the airplane. The pilot recalled that the weather conditions were overcast at 8,000 feet, but clear below with no glare or visibility issues. The Cessna was equipped with a Garmin G1000 and they recorded their data, and this is what the data looked like. So right here over the Minden airport, this is their initial departure out of the airport, and then they came over here and did a bunch of maneuvers. Then they came back in on that instrument approach, did a missed approach to a crosswind, to a downwind, to a touch and go, and then to the left crosswind to enter downwind when the mid-air collision occurred. Now on to the Swift aircraft. A friend of the Swift pilot stated that the pilot sent him a text at 0925 on the morning of the accident stating that he was preparing to move his airplane from the Pine Nut Airport, Gardnerville, over to Minden. The pilot explained that he wanted to move the Swift before an incoming storm and avoid a potentially muddy airstrip before the upcoming Swift fly-in in Jackson, California. The friend was waiting for the pilot at Minden and planning to drive him back to Gardnerville. The friend further stated that he knew the pilot well and had purchased his Swift airplane from Don, the pilot. Don bought and sold quite a few Swifts as he rebuilt them over there at his place in Pine Nut. He described the pilot as being meticulous and would consistently follow the same routines during flights. He described the pilot's typical flight path from Pine Nut to Minden, which involved flying west initially, then north along the mountain range, as the airplane would get near the ski pools, and he's describing this pattern here. The pilot would make a radio call to enter the 45-degree angle to intercept the downwind leg for runway 34. The pilot would fly his interception crossing over 395 and then adjoin the downwind with a close-in traffic pattern. The friend emphasized that the pilot was diligent about listening for traffic and maintaining a constant lookout for other aircraft in the area. The Swift was not equipped with NTSB and no radar data was available at the time of this writing. The pilot often flew the friend's Swift, I assume the friend that was waiting for him at the airport to take him back, and his aircraft was equipped with NTSB, and it was wired through the navigation lights. So with the navigation lights need to be on in order for the NTSB to operate. And a higher horsepower engine than the accident Swift. I think the accident Swift had 150 horsepower Lycoming in it. Normally these Swift get modified up to 180 horse Lycoming. Of course, originally they came with the 0300 145 horsepower Continental 6-cylinder engine. Investigators located several flight tracks that were attributed to when the pilot was flying, one of which occurred on July 20th, 24, and originated from Pine Nut and terminated at Minden. And that's what's shown in this figure here. The friend confirmed that this was the pilot's exact normal pattern and that the pilot was flying the airplane at the time that this pattern was flown. It is presumed that the prior approximate 15 minutes flight was similar to the accident flight path. And when they overlay this old GPS track with the accident GPS track of the 206, they find that they do overlap right at about where the mid-air collision occurred. Investigators were able to corroborate this testimony with security camera footage. Numerous cameras captured low-quality footage of the airplane's movements leading up to the impact. An airport security camera showed the Cessna on crosswind in a gradual ascent and the Swift arriving from Jacks Valley, northwest of Minden. See figure 3 below. So this camera is located here at the Minden airport and looking towards the northwest, directly towards the mid-air collision. A dash cam video from a driver heading north on 395 showed the Swift crossing from the west over the freeway heading eastward and at a slightly higher altitude than the Cessna just prior to impact. And that's these pictures down here. After impact, the Swift can be seen erupting in flames and falling near vertical to the fields below, and it could not be determined if the Swift had made evasive maneuvers prior to impact or if either airplane had navigation or strobe lights on operating at the time of the accident. They couldn't tell from looking at these pictures whether the strobe lights or nav lights were on. So we got the two aircraft coming together on what appears to me to be the crosswind leg of the Cessna 206, crosswind turning to downwind, with the Swift aircraft on my right hand here approaching on the 45-degree entry, and they're coming together just like this. The high-wing Cessna aircraft here was climbing slightly, while the Swift low-wing aircraft was descending slightly at the point of impact. So if this is runway 34 here at Minden, and here's the pattern that the Cessna 206 is making, we can see the Cessna 206 making a relatively large pattern, whereas the Swift pilot is going to come in on a 45 and make a much smaller pattern that would have been inside the pattern of the Cessna 206. Thus, they would be crossing right here at the crosswind for the 206. Once the midair occurred, the Cessna 206 pilot was able to turn left quickly right to runway 12 and do an emergency landing on runway 12. And the cowling that was up blocking his view eventually flew off of the aircraft. Now on to the communications. Minden, of course, is a non-tower airport with a common traffic advisory frequency, CTAF, of 123.05. The non-tower airport recorded the CTAF transmissions. A review of these recordings revealed that 11 minutes before the accident, the left-seated pilot of the Cessna transmitted that they were 10 miles from the airport. They intended to perform touch and go and practice takeoffs and landings. Shortly thereafter, he reported overflying the runway and entering the downwind leg for the traffic pattern for runway 34. His subsequent transmissions provided position reports as the airplane proceeded through the pattern. He first reported that the airplane was on the downwind leg, then on the base leg, and finally at 094414, he announced that they were on final approach for runway 34. So it sounds like that was the last radio transmission from the Cessna 206 prior to the collision. The impact occurred at 094653 estimated. The first radio call we get from the Swift pilot is at 094636, just 17 seconds prior to impact. At 094636, the Swift pilot reported being on a 45-degree intercept to the downwind leg for runway 34. 10 seconds later, the Cessna pilot transmitted that they were on a crosswind to the left. It is presumed that the two airplanes collided during this transmission, with the impact occurring at 094653. At 094802, the Cessna pilot reported being on the runway, indicating a loss of engine power. 28 seconds later, they still weren't even convinced what happened to the 206. They thought it was an engine failure. 28 seconds later, the right-seated pilot of the Cessna made a radio call stating that they had been involved in a mid-air collision and requested the dispatch of medical and fire services. They found bits of wreckage of both airplanes in a widely scattered area over 1,025 feet. The green dots indicate the Swift, and the red dots indicate parts from the Cessna. And it looks like the tail of the Swift was chopped clean off. On the Cessna, the red dye here is from, or the red oil is from the propeller hub of the Cessna propeller. It's used like a dye to indicate when there is a leak in the propeller hub. One of the propeller blades, one of the three propeller blades of the 206 was knocked clean off, and the tip of that blade was buried back inside the Cessna 206 right here on the upper right corner, just behind the firewall. And the tail wheel of the Swift was found lodged in the engine of the Cessna 206 on the right-hand side of the engine, under the cylinders. So two aircraft coming together in the pattern on the crosswind and 45 entry without ever having seen each other, and the Swift pilot making a radio transmission, the first and only radio transmission just 17 seconds prior to impact, emphasizes the importance of proper radio procedures at airports without operational control towers. The only actual federal aviation regulation regarding operation of aircraft at uncontrolled airports or airports without an operational control tower is this one, 91-126. The rest of the policies and procedures for operating at these sort of airports is recommended by the Airman's Information Manual and an advisory circular. Advisory Circular 90-66 Charlie. Back to the FARs, the only regulation states that each pilot of an airplane must make all turns of that airplane to the left unless the airport displays approved light signals or visual markings indicating that turns should be made to the right, in which case the pilot must make all turns to the right. The Airman's Information Manual makes the following recommendations for operations at non-tower airports. 1. Pilots of inbound traffic should monitor and communicate as appropriate on the designated CTAF frequency from 10 miles to landing. Pilots of departing aircraft should monitor and communicate on the appropriate frequency from startup, during taxi, and until 10 miles from the airport, unless the CFRs or local procedures require otherwise. 2. Pilots of aircraft conducting other than arriving or departing operations at altitudes normally used by the arriving or departing aircraft should also monitor and communicate on the appropriate frequency while within 10 miles of the airport, unless CFRs require otherwise. Such operations include parachute jumping, dropping, en route, practicing maneuvers, etc. So anytime you're within 10 miles of an airport without an operational control tower and at a reasonable altitude, you should be on that frequency and talking to them. Advisory Circular 90-66 Charlie expands on this even further, and here in 10-4 recommended traffic advisory practices. And this whole advisory circular needs an entire video series of its own. There's a lot of excellent information in here. 10-4-1, arriving aircraft, again, approximately 10 miles from the destination airport, monitor the CTAF frequency and self-announce your position, altitude, and intention. Also, all traffic within a 10-mile radius of a non-towered airport or part-time towered airport when the control tower is not operating should monitor and communicate their intentions on the CTAF frequency as they approach to enter the traffic pattern to avoid a traffic conflict. So in my opinion, here's the way I see this playing out. A bit of complacency with radio procedures in the traffic pattern. The Cessna 206 pilot has the pattern to himself, or so he believes, because he hears nobody else in the traffic pattern or nobody else coming into the traffic pattern. Because the Swift does not have ADSB, he doesn't see anything on his ForeFlight regarding another airplane anywhere near the traffic pattern area. So his last radio call is on final for 3-4. It sounds like he does not state the fact that he's going to do a touch and go out of this landing. He doesn't state that he doesn't make a radio call after he does his touch and go, and he doesn't make his crosswind radio call until much too late. The Swift aircraft, doing the same routine he's done for years and years, makes a radio call, one single radio call, much too close to the pattern. Had the Swift pilot made a 10-mile out call, a 5-mile out call, a maneuvering for the 45 entry, that would have alerted both pilots that there are other aircraft in the pattern, and that would have alerted the Cessna 206 pilot that they were going to encounter a conflict in the pattern with the 45 traffic versus the crosswind traffic. Had the two pilots been communicating with each other, this accident could have been avoided altogether. Because proper radio calls allow you to get the situational awareness that you need to allow see and avoid to work, because we all know that see and avoid doesn't always work. We need some additional input to know where to look for the other aircraft. And according to our local DPE, fully 95% of all applicants on check rides don't look for other traffic on the crosswind, and 60% of applicants don't lower the high wing prior to turning. So you've got to look before you turn. Look left, turn left. Thank you so much for your support of this channel, especially the folks over on Patreon that make this content possible. If this sort of detailed look at these accident reviews helps you, please consider liking and subscribing, even though the information that we're covering here is so tragic. Thank you for your support. Let's get out there and be more proficient on the radio. I want to hear your 10-mile call, your 5-mile call, your 45 call. talk to each other out there in the pattern. And set a good example for your other fellow aviators. All of us get complacent with our radio calls that have been flying for a very long time. Thank you so much for your support. See you here.